The strange events sweeping across New York became impossible for Peter Parker to ignore once he realized that fragments of forgotten memories were surfacing inside people's minds all over the city. For several days afterward, he kept investigating the strange symbol he'd found at the warehouse while quietly searching for the man who had warned him about the collapsing barrier between realities. That man had vanished without a trace, taking every document with him except for one damaged photograph Peter had managed to hang on to. Peter spent hours poring over that single image, enlarging every detail, comparing the strange energy pattern visible in the background against old recordings of the original memory spell. What he found didn't match anything he'd ever encountered before, because the signature wasn't purely magical, and it wasn't purely scientific either. It seemed to sit somewhere in between the two, functioning almost like a bridge, something actively connecting memories, objects, and people across different realities. Peter had hoped at first that Doctor Strange might be able to explain all of it. But when he tried reaching out, there was nothing but silence on the other end, and that worried him more than almost anything else happening around him, because Strange had never once been difficult to reach when the fate of reality was actually on the line. Peter eventually made his way to the Sanctum Sanctorum in person, only to find it sealed behind layers of magical protection, with Strange nowhere to be found inside. He could sense that something serious had happened there, but he couldn't force his way through the barrier without risking making an already dangerous situation even worse. So he turned back to the streets and kept investigating alone, one lead at a time. The first major incident hit an apartment building in Queens, which briefly transformed into something Peter had never seen before in his life. Emergency calls flooded the police department within minutes as terrified residents reported their homes changing right in front of them. Walls aged decades in an instant. Furniture shifted and rearranged itself. Family photographs on the walls suddenly showed people nobody recognized. Several residents abruptly remembered living in apartments they had never actually occupied, describing rooms and neighbors that didn't match anything real. Peter arrived within minutes and found the building genuinely caught between two overlapping realities, one hallway looking completely ordinary, the other burned and long abandoned, both existing in the same space at once. He moved carefully through the distorted structure until he found a little girl sitting alone near a staircase, crying because she couldn't find her mother, insisting over and over that her mother had been standing right there in the hallway only moments before. Peter followed the direction she pointed and found a doorway that had no business existing at all. Through it, he could see another version of the same apartment, decades older, and on the far side, a woman searching frantically for her missing daughter. He reached toward the doorway to help, and the entire room snapped violently back to normal before he could cross through. The little girl was reunited with her mother seconds later, but neither of them remembered a single thing about what had just happened to them. Peter stood there in the sudden quiet, realizing with growing dread that this phenomenon wasn't limited to memory anymore. Reality itself was starting to forget which version of itself was actually supposed to exist. The incidents only grew more frequent after that night. A subway station briefly transformed into an entirely different station before snapping back a few seconds later. A police officer suddenly remembered arresting a suspect who had never existed anywhere in this universe. A man walking through Central Park caught a fleeting glimpse of a version of New York where the park was surrounded by bombed-out, destroyed buildings. Objects began appearing out of nowhere too. A strange piece of technology materialized in a Manhattan alley, covered in circuitry nobody could identify. A newspaper turned up on a subway seat carrying a date that didn't exist on any calendar. A photograph surfaced showing Peter standing beside people he had genuinely never met in his life. Each incident lasted only seconds or minutes before fading, but Peter could tell the frequency kept climbing steadily night after night. The more people out there remembered him, the more unstable the whole world seemed to become around him. Then Peter uncovered something even more unsettling. Every single major disturbance had occurred within a few miles of someone who had recently recovered a memory of him. He started quietly tracking those individuals down and found that most of them shared the exact same symptoms: headaches, vivid dreams, sudden emotional reactions to strangers they'd never met, memories of places that simply didn't exist. Some people remembered Spider-Man specifically. Others remembered Peter Parker by name. A rare few remembered both at once, and those people, without exception, triggered the strongest disturbances of all. Peter realized their memories were functioning like small openings punched between realities, and the more powerful and specific the memory, the wider that opening became. One night, following one of these disturbances, Peter tracked it down to an underground parking garage in Manhattan. The whole structure sat completely empty except for a single abandoned car parked beneath a bank of flickering overhead lights. He approached carefully, spider sense already prickling, and noticed immediately that something was very wrong. The car's license plate kept changing every few seconds. New York, then California, then a plate number that matched no state at all. Peter reached out to touch the car and was hit instantly by a violent flash of memory that wasn't his own. He saw himself standing inside an unfamiliar laboratory, surrounded by strangers. He saw MJ dressed in a completely different style of clothing than he'd ever seen her wear. He saw Ned holding some kind of device that looked ripped straight out of a science fiction film. And behind all of them, a group of masked criminals he didn't recognize at all. The vision vanished almost as quickly as it hit, leaving Peter gasping, struggling to catch his breath. He understood, with a sickening certainty, that he hadn't just relived a memory from his own life. He had seen an entirely different Peter Parker's life instead. Before he could even begin processing what he'd just witnessed, every light in the garage cut out at once. Something moved in the sudden darkness. Peter yanked his mask on instantly, spider sense screaming a warning. A figure stepped into the faint remaining light at the far end of the garage, and for a split second Peter assumed it was just another person caught up in the dimensional disturbance. Then the figure closed the distance between them with unnatural, inhuman speed. Peter threw himself backward just as a massive blast tore straight through the concrete wall behind where he'd been standing. The attacker wore a dark armored suit lined with strange metallic circuitry, a mask concealing almost his entire face. Peter fired webs at him on instinct, but the attacker simply sliced through them with a glowing blade mounted along his forearm. Peter dodged the follow-up strike and slammed the man hard into a concrete support pillar, an impact that should have dropped an ordinary person instantly. Instead, the attacker recovered almost immediately, clearly operating with enhanced strength and reflexes far beyond anything human. The fight raged through the garage as Peter desperately tried to read his opponent. The attacker never spoke a single word. Every move he made seemed engineered specifically to counter Spider-Man's own fighting style, anticipating the web shots, dodging every strike, using the environment against him with unsettling precision. Eventually Peter managed to trap him beneath a section of collapsed concrete and yanked the mask off, half expecting to recognize a familiar face underneath. He didn't. It was a stranger he'd never seen before in his life. The man's eyes snapped open, locking directly onto Peter's, and he whispered something that made Peter's whole body freeze in place. "You were supposed to die." Peter stumbled back a step. "What?" The stranger's expression shifted, confused, almost horrified by his own realization. "You're not my Spider-Man." Before Peter could ask what that even meant, the man's entire body began flickering like a corrupted video feed, his armor disappearing for a fraction of a second, replaced by a completely different costume, then another and another after that. Peter watched, stunned, as several different versions of the same person flashed in and out of existence right in front of him, being physically pulled between realities in real time. He reached out to help, but the stranger let out a scream as a burst of raw energy tore through the garage. When the light finally faded, the attacker was simply gone. Peter searched the wreckage and found a small metallic device embedded in the concrete floor, stamped with the same circular symbol he'd photographed back at the warehouse. He brought it home and studied it for hours under his kitchen lamp, and the conclusion he came to was worse than he'd expected. The device wasn't just recording dimensional energy readings, it was actively amplifying them. Someone had deliberately engineered technology specifically designed to force open temporary connections between realities. These disturbances weren't accidents or side effects. Someone was making them happen on purpose. The following day, Peter went back to the warehouse where that first criminal had called him Parker without any explanation. Police had long since cleared the building, but Peter searched the upper floors anyway and found a hidden room tucked behind a false wall. Inside were dozens of photographs and newspaper clippings, all documenting Spider-Man's activity across New York, some recent, some clearly years old. But the strangest images by far showed Spider-Man locked in battle with enemies Peter had never once encountered in his life. One photo showed a green armored figure attacking him on a rooftop. Another showed a masked man with mechanical arms. A third showed an enormous reptilian creature standing in the middle of a city street. Peter stared at each one in disbelief. These weren't criminals from his world at all. They were enemies from other realities entirely. At the base of the wall, a handwritten note had been left behind. "The memories are bringing them back." Peter understood the danger instantly. The spell hadn't simply made the world forget Peter Parker. It had severed the connections between his own universe and countless alternate versions of his life. And now, one memory at a time, those connections were reopening. Every recovered memory was punching another doorway through the wall between worlds. If this kept accelerating, it wouldn't stop at bringing memories back. It would eventually bring people back too. He rushed to the sanctum sanctorum a second time, hoping the barrier had weakened enough to let him inside. This time the door stood partially open. Inside, the building was in total disarray, books floating aimlessly through the air, magical artifacts scattered across the floor, several windows showing views of places that clearly weren't New York at all. Peter pushed further into the building and found a message glowing across one of the walls in shifting letters of light. The spell is not failing. He stared at it for a long moment before a second line appeared underneath the first. It is being undone. His stomach dropped. Nobody was simply waiting for the spell to collapse on its own. Someone was actively, deliberately reversing it. Before he could investigate any further, every magical artifact in the room started vibrating at once, and a portal tore open in the center of the sanctum. Peter braced himself for another attack, but instead of a villain, a voice came through the opening. His own voice. Older. Angrier. And unmistakably terrified. Peter, if you can hear this, don't trust the memories, it said. Peter stepped closer, heart pounding, as the alternate version of himself kept going. They aren't memories anymore. The portal began to collapse in on itself. Peter lunged toward it desperately. Who is doing this? He shouted. The voice answered with one final sentence before the portal vanished completely. You're doing it. Peter stood alone in the sudden silence of the sanctum, unable to make sense of what he'd just heard. He hadn't opened any portals. He hadn't reversed the spell. He hadn't dragged alternate realities back into his own world. And yet somewhere out there, in the middle of this spreading disturbance, another version of himself seemed completely convinced that he was the one responsible for all of it. Peter caught his own reflection in a shattered mirror lying nearby and for the first time since this had all started, found himself wondering whether the greatest threat here wasn't something breaking into his world from outside at all. Maybe it was something inside him. Then his phone buzzed sharply in his pocket. A new message had come through, no photograph this time, just 3 words. MJ remembers everything. Peter bolted toward the nearest window. Across the city, a massive wave of blue-white energy erupted above Manhattan, swallowing the skyline whole in a blinding wash of light. For one terrifying second, Peter could see hundreds of silhouettes standing inside that glow. Some wearing costumes he recognized instantly, some clearly monstrous, some unmistakably heroic. And one of them, standing perfectly still at the center of it all, looked exactly like him. Peter pulled his mask down over his face. Then he jumped. The war between realities had officially begun.